Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining session 2 in our Supported Decision Making in Delaware speaking series. My name is Ashley Steinbrecher. I am a researcher with the Delaware Network for Excellence in Autism, or DNEA. The DNEA is housed at the University of Delaware's Center for Disability Studies and offers training, technical assistance, and information dissemination that benefits people with autism, their families, and the professionals who serve them. A resource guide that supplements today's topic, along with PowerPoint slides from each session and other related resources, have been compiled onto a Padlet to share with you today. The link to access this Padlet will be dropped in the chat. Today's resource guide and other topic-specific resource guides are also available to download on the DNEA webpage. We will be placing an evaluation link in the chat at the end of this session. We will also send it to you as part of a post-session follow-up email. Thank you in advance for taking the time to complete this evaluation. We are very excited to welcome back our guest speaker for this series, Jonathan Martinis. Jonathan is an attorney and the Senior Director for Law and Policy for the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University, with over 20 years of experience representing and advocating for people with disabilities. Jonathan plans to incorporate enough time throughout his presentation for some questions. Please add any questions you may have to the Q&A. Thank you again for being with us here today, and Jonathan, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you everyone for joining me on this second presentation. I always said the greatest compliment that you can pay to a speaker is after he finishes talking the first time, actually coming back for the second. You had a chance to escape, and yet you still chose to come back. So thank you for doing that. If you were here for the last time we spoke, you heard what I would call a why presentation, why supported decision-making is important, why it can help, and why it should be explored. The next two, starting with today, are going to be what I call how presentations, how to incorporate supported decision-making into the supports and services and activities that are most important to people with disabilities. Today, we're going to be talking about two things: special education and vocational rehabilitation, and how we can use supported decision-making to make those supports and services more effective. So as we begin, I'll share my screen. And first, a quick review about supported decision-making, starting with what I call an article of faith, starting with what's going to carry us through this entire first part of this presentation. And that's this, something that we know, something that we can take as a given. And that's students, young adults with disabilities, who come out of school with more self-determination, who have more skills in the area of self-determination, have better adult lives. Young adults who come out of school more self-determined are more successful as adults. They're more likely to work and live independently and have further education. So what is self-determination? We talked about that last time. Self-determination is having control over your life. People who are self-determined do things instead of having things done to them. People who are self-determined make decisions instead of having decisions made for them. So when you hear me talk about self-determination, think about it about being in control of your life, about calling the shots, making the choices, and making your own way in your own life. Because we know this from 40 years of studies, people with disabilities, especially those with intellectual developmental disabilities, with more self-determination, have a better quality of life. They're more likely to live independently, work, be safer, better well-adjusted, better able to resist and avoid abuse. So with that in mind, that article of faith isn't very surprising, isn't it? People with disabilities have better lives when they are more self-determined. Students with disabilities will have better lives if they become more self-determined. Remember that the other side of that equation is true also, that when people lose self-determination, when their right to make choices is taken away, when they were denied that opportunity to make those choices, their lives get worse. People whose right to make choices are taken away will feel helpless and hopeless and self-critical. They won't try new things. They will feel worse about the things they're already doing. The other side of that, of course, is the better quality of life, the things that are important to us. If you are a parent, these are the things that you want for your child, isn't it? If you're a teacher, these are the things you want for your students: to be more independent, to be more involved in their communities, to be healthier and happier. Well, how do we get there? One of the key ways to get there that we talked about is supported decision-making, a way to put people with disabilities more in charge, more in control of their lives, so that they can be the ones who make the decisions to the maximum of their ability. I have the definition of supported decision-making up on your screen. You'll remember that I wrote it, and therefore I hate it. What I want you to think about when you think about supported decision-making is how you make decisions. What you do when you don't know what to do. When the doctor speaks jargon, you say, would you please explain that to me in plain language? When you don't know something about your taxes or your finances, you talk to someone, an accountant, you use TurboTax, you talk to a friend like I do to get advice. When you're dealing with a personal matter that you know is really impacting you, you go to a buddy for support. These are the people who help you understand the issues. These are the people who help you crystallize your options, who help you make that pro and con list, who help you make sure you're not making a snap judgment, that you're making an informed choice, that you are not going off half-cocked, that you are getting the second opinion that you need. All those sayings I just used, they're just ways of saying, get help. Use supported decision-making. So that's our background. That's what supported decision-making is. It's getting help when you need it, how you need it, from the people you need it from, so that you can understand your situations, understand the decisions you have to make, understand your options, and pick the one that's best for you. And what we know is that people who do that, people with disabilities who do that, who use supported decision-making, who make their choices instead of having choices made for them, their lives are better. They have more self-determination. Not rocket science. If I'm making my own choices, instead of you making choices for me, I'm going to have more control over my life. And we showed that in a study in Virginia that came out 2 years ago, showing that young adults who used supported decision-making to make decisions, who were empowered by their families and friends, their supporters, to use and make their own decisions, had better lives. In just the time we were collecting data, those who were using SDM were more confident, felt more independent. They and their supporters felt they were better at making decisions. Specifically, their supporters, generally parents, felt they were making objectively better decisions. Why? They were more self-determined. And as you'll hear me say time and time again, I hope you don't get sick of it, but it's the biggest point I can make. Self-determination is the key to a better life for young adults, for adults, for all people with disabilities. So let's talk about education. Let's talk about that article of faith we started with, that students with more self-determination are more successful as an adult. Because if you think about it, outside of the home, where do you first learn to make decisions? Where is your first exposure to other people, where you have to get along with other people, where you have to make choices, budget your time, figure out what you're going to do? It's school, isn't it? Well, if you're in special education, you are covered by a law called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, what I'm going to call IDEA. And IDEA says this. It says that schools have the obligation to make sure that students are able to get supports and services, able to get an education through special education where they receive educational benefits. Those are the exact words the Supreme Court used, educational benefits. Well, if we went around this room and I asked all of you what an educational benefit is, you'd all give me a different answer. You'd all give me good answers. Some of you would talk about free, appropriate public education. Some of you would talk about least restrictive environment, mainstreaming, accessing the curriculum, inclusion, opportunities. All of those are correct answers. I'll tell you the best answer, though. This is what an educational benefit is. This comes directly from IDEA. Remember, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the law that creates and regulates special education. It says really clearly what the whole point of special education is. It says it right out there in the first section. Look at the bold words. The whole point of special education is to prepare students for further future education, employment, and independent living. And what do we know directly contributes to education, employment, and independent living? Self-determination, our article of faith. That means that the whole point of education, at the bottom, at its base, the entire point of special education is building self-determination. Those are not my words. Those are the words of study after study, often sponsored by the US Department of Education. Self-determination, promoting it, teaching it, building it is a best practice. Schools should focus on enhancing self-determination, especially when it comes to decision-making, teaching students to advocate for themselves, to make their own decisions, to understand the decision-making process and put it into play. That's great, but here's the problem. With schools having this as their obligation, preparing students for independent living, with schools having the charge of building self-determination, what we know, unfortunately, is that the number one referral source for guardianship are schools and school personnel. I was part of the study in 2015. We asked guardians, we asked people around the country. We said, if you're a guardian or if you were prompted to seek guardianship, who was the one who told you you should do that? What was the first person to say, you know, you should get guardianship of your child or your loved one? We were frankly expecting to hear family members as the number one or lawyers. Nope. Number one with a bullet, school personnel, usually at an IEP meeting. Someone meaning well and saying something like, if you don't get guardianship, you cannot come to an IEP meeting after your child turns 18. An incorrect statement, by the way, factually and legally. The National Council on Disability, just a couple of years ago, documented what they call the school to guardianship pipeline. How kids go directly from one to the other because of, frankly, well-meaning teachers and others who think that there is no other way, who have been taught that there is no other choice. Well, what we're going to talk about are other options. Because if we believe in the article of faith, if we believe in the science, and if we believe in self-determination as the key to a better life for young adults with disabilities and people with disabilities in general, then what special education should be focusing on is exactly what the studies say it should be focusing on: self-determination. If self-determination is the default option, guardianship doesn't really even come into the picture unless it's truly needed. Of course, there are times guardianship is truly needed. I've said that before. I will say it forever. Of course, guardianship can be appropriate. But what we should be looking at, especially when kids are younger, is how to enhance self-determination as the key, because that's the key to a better quality of life. And then if there is no way to empower the person to make his or her own decisions, of course, guardianship's appropriate. But why start there? Why start there? Where we should be starting is making sure that self-determination and decision-making are part of the special education process from day one, as early as possible, making sure that students have those opportunities to be self-determined. In fact, District of Columbia Public Schools, where I do a lot of work, they start talking about supported decision-making and self-determination in pre-K. I have done many presentations with their transition coordinator who says, as I think is 100% true, transition to adulthood begins in pre-K. But what she says, and she says it in a bragging way, is they've got 3-year-olds talking about their networks. And I know that sounds funny. I always laugh. That joke always gets a laugh. But here's the deal. You know, it's funny to think of some 3- and 4-year-old asking friends, you know, to help him or her solve the cookie versus cracker decision, to figure out what the pros of apple juice are versus the pros of orange juice. And it does sound funny, but think about it. If you take a 3- or 4-year-old and you make sure that 3- or 4-year-old knows that there is a choice to be made and that he or she has to make that choice, and that he or she should get help making that choice, should seek a network of people to help make that choice, then what you've done in that situation is you have created a habit. You have taught that child that's what you should do when you have to make a choice. So as the child gets older, as decisions get harder, the child's going to know what to do. Of course, decisions get more complex when you're 6 and 7 and 8 and 13 and 18. Those are some of the hardest decisions. But if you lay the groundwork, then you are teaching that child you're a decision maker and you should seek help making those decisions. So DC Public Schools has what I consider to be the first policy in the country on supported decision making and young adults in school. In DC, they're working with kids as young as 3 to identify who their people are, who their networks are, and at the same time working with parents to let parents know that it's okay to get help making decisions, that they can be part of a supportive network with other people that child is important, and that they can work together to seek and give the assistance that child needs. Because here's the deal, as they get older, the whole point of that process is as the child gets older, more decisions get made. And the process continues. In ninth grade, DC Public Schools starts introducing more formalized supported decision-making, asking kids to really identify who they want and how they want it done. And at 18, they give kids a chance to sign off on a supported decision-making agreement for education, where they say, I do want mom and dad at my IEP meetings. Yes, I know it's my choice. Yes, I know I'm the final decision maker, but here are people I want to come. Here are people I want to be part of my process. I do give them access to that information. And just like that, what happens is, instead of the question of, are you a legal adult who can't authorize people to come, you are a legal decision maker who does authorize people to come, who has made that decision. And what a great practice for life. What a great way to practice for what you're going to have to do as an adult, to say, I want this team to do these things at this time. So that's what we should be doing from a young age with students. I tell parents, and I'm telling the people listening to this, if you are a parent of a child in special education, first things first, get that child to his or her IEP meeting every time. If the child can't stay very long, so be it. But let that kid know, this is my team. They are there for me. We work together. And make that part of the IEP. There should be IEP goals and objectives around self-determination every year. You should be looking at that child's abilities to be self-determined every year. And I'm going to show you a way that you can do that without needing new goals. And if there are teachers out there, if there are parents here, you're feeling overwhelmed, now I have to do something else. No, you don't. You don't have to come up with a whole new process. You don't have to come up with a whole new set of goals. I'll tell you why. Because self-determination should be part of every goal. It should be part of every objective. So if I'm asking kids to learn about math, we should be including self-determination in the way that they do it. If we're talking about learning about English, there should be self-determination as a way. I call those I statements. We can make self-determination and supported decision-making part of every goal without ever using those words. I mean, think about some of the goals you must have seen. I call them boring goals. We see boring goals all the time that don't mean anything. The student shall use proper grammar 75% of the time. Well, I mean, who cares? To the student, who cares about using proper grammar 75% of the time? And by the way, if the student doesn't use proper grammar 75% of the time, what happens? Student fails. There's no learning. There's no progress. It's just, thou shalt use proper grammar. What is that building? So what an I statement does is it is designed to meet that goal, that grammar goal, for example, but in a way that enhances self-determination and builds skills. I'll give you an example. Instead of an old, boring goal, the student will use proper grammar 75% of the time. And by the way, I know if there are teachers, professionals out there, that is an appropriate goal. You have to have English language goals, you have to have composition goals, and they have to be measurable. That's a measurable goal, I understand. But here's another measurable goal we can make. Instead of the boring goal, I, student, will work with my teacher or my aide or my counselor or whoever to choose subjects I'm interested in and write stories about them using proper grammar at least 3 out of every 4 times. Now think about that goal. Of course, it's specific and measurable. It's writing, and it's about grammar, and it's measurable. 3 out of every 4 times, 75%. But look at the other parts. I will work with my teacher to choose subjects, and I will write the stories. The student must do something. The student must take charge. The student must be self-determined in the way he or she works. And you know what happens if you're not getting it? You go back and you work more with your teacher. There's a backup. I will work with my teacher. What if I don't get it? I'll keep working with my teacher. What if my grammar isn't good? I'll work with my teacher on that. I will do those things. I am getting support. I am being self-determined. I am choosing with my teacher's help. We never use the words self-determination or supported decision-making in that goal, and yet it's all through it. I'll give you another example. The student will reduce the number of times he is late by 50%. Once again, who cares? What's it teaching? What's it doing? You're failing or you're passing. You're not learning any new skills. I statement. I will work with my aide, my parent, my mother, my brother, whoever, to come up with a plan that makes sure I'm on time for school more than 50% of the time. It's measurable, be on time for school, but I will work to develop a plan. I, self-determination, will work with support to come up with a plan, decision-making. They're built into that goal. And you know what happens if the plan doesn't work? You don't fail. You go back and you make another plan. In other words, the student is charged to make decisions, to act on them, and to correct them if they don't work. The student is part of the process. And part of the process is hugely important because that's where goals are made. Goals are made during the IEP process, the Individualized Education Program process. And I have heard so many complaints about IEP meetings that are reactive. It's 8 people around the table talking at me. Well, best practices calls for what's called the student-led IEP, where the student takes the lead in the IEP. The student actually engages in self-determination and supported decision-making. And it goes differently while the student ages. That's why I say get your kid to the meeting age 3 if you can, because that student's responsibilities are supposed to increase every year. At age 3, the kid might just be able to introduce him or herself or wave or say it's my team. As you get older, those things can improve, knowing that it's my team. The next year, I might introduce the people around the table who I know. This is my mom and dad. This is my teacher. The next year, it might be, these are my favorite classes. This is what I like to do. This is my plan for the future. These are the things I think I do well. These are the things I think I need help in. And if you've been through the IEP process, what that entire conversation is the present level of performance. It's a necessary part of every IEP, and the student can lead it. And the student, as the student gets older, can say, here's where I think I need help. Here's the kind of help I like. Here are the classes I like the most, but here's where I'd like help in them. The student becomes the leader, with the goal being, when the student turns 18, it's a true team. The student is working with the team with the student, and together they develop their goals and objectives. So when that student's 18, the student can say, yes, thank you for your help. I agree. I sign my own IEP. The student works with the team. The student gets help from the team. The student talks to the team. They work together. So in the end, the student can make the decision to sign the IEP. Doesn't that sound just like supported decision-making? If you remember Jenny Hatch's case, the story we told last time, how her psychologist said she should be surrounded by people who understand her and support her and love her and give her the help she needs. Doesn't that sound like a really well-functioning IEP team? All those people there, parents and teachers and regular ed and special ed and administrative and a speech language professional or whoever else, working together with the student taking the lead to the maximum of his or her abilities. Is every student going to be able to do that? No, but every student can take at least more of a role than they have before. And we know that doing that helps. We have studies that say that students who lead their IEP meetings do better as adults and do better as students. They're more self-confident. They're better able to advocate themselves. They work better with adults. They know more about their abilities and limitations and what they can do to address them. Isn't that on your screen what we want for our students if you're a teacher, or for our children if you're a parent? You want them to be self-confident. You want them to advocate for themselves. You want them to work with their peers and adults. Well, it can happen. We have studies that show that the simple act of using self-determination, of leading your IEP team, can lead to the results you want. So why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we saying we should be acting in this way? How can we get there? How can we get to that point where we're making these goals, where we are working together to put these goals in place? First thing you should do, in my opinion, ask the second you can. First day of school, first day you move into the district, anytime, you ask that school, what is your policy on self-determination and decision-making? Don't be surprised if they don't have one. Lots of schools know that self-determination is a good idea. There was one study that said something like 80% of teachers knew that self-determination was very beneficial, but less than, I think it was 50% of schools actually had a policy on self-determination goals. So ask, What are we going to, how can we, I would like to do I statements. Are you familiar with I statements? Are you familiar with the student-led IEP? I would like to try that and have the student involved in the IEP process from day one. The sooner you do it, the better you're going to be, the better opportunities you're going to have. If someone asks, well, we don't have students come to our IEP meetings, show them this study. That just the simple act of being part of the team and leading the team gives the results that schools want and that parents want, and frankly, that kids should have. Next, understand that you as a parent have the right to request evaluations of anything. An evaluation is an absolute right under IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So you have a right to request an evaluation of anything that might be impacting the student's educational performance. There's a citation to the law where it says that. Well, if we know that part of the special educational performance is supposed to be preparing students for independent living, and we feel that the student has limitations in independent living skills, wouldn't it make sense to ask for an evaluation on it? So look at your screen, steal my language, feel free. You can write a letter to the special education director or the head of the IEP team. Dear person, I think that my child, Jonathan, has limitations in decision making or limitations in self-determination that are keeping Jonathan from making educational progress, including being prepared for independent living. Therefore, I ask that you do an evaluation to see if this is the case, and then figure out what to do that will help Jonathan overcome those limitations. And the school, when they receive a request for evaluation like that, generally has two choices. One, they can give you the evaluation. Or two, they can say, we don't have to and take you to due process. Schools hate going to due process. So ask respectfully. They may ask, what do you want us to do? And you say, I'd like to work with you to figure that out. There are models out there. There's one called I'm Determined, imdetermined.org, that have student-led and teacher-led self-determination evaluations. But the key that you want the school to do is make sure, check it out, see if Jonathan is having difficulties making decisions, is having difficulties directing his life, so that we can address them now. And when the school does that, it'll be a school personnel who does it. That's what the law says. And whatever they come back with, the IEP team has to look at it. If the person comes back and says, yes, Jonathan does have these limitations 1, 2, 3, 4, that I think we should address A, B, C, D, the IEP team has to put those into play. If you don't agree with the evaluation, you can ask for another one. You can ask for an independent one, or an independent educational evaluation, or IEE. What an IEE is, it's a second bite at the apple. Only this one is done by someone who does not work for the school. You can choose the person who does the IEE as long as that person is willing to, one, work for the rates that the school will pay, and two, is qualified to make this evaluation. So you can do that. Steal my language. Dear school, I respectfully disagree with the results of your evaluation. I still think that Jonathan has limitations in decision-making and self-determination that are preventing him from making progress toward independent living. Therefore, I am requesting an independent educational evaluation at public expense. There's a key. The citation to the law is right there. And they have two choices. They have to do it or take you to due process. They may ask you, who do you want to do this? And you can say, I don't know. Who do you have in mind? Or if you have someone in mind, you can bring it up. But the key here is it's a second evaluation that the IEP team must consider. They may not have to do it. An evaluation by the school personnel, this one, if the school determines there's a problem, they have to take steps to address it. If the IEE does, the IEP team has to at least discuss it and go through it, and then gives you a chance to advocate for it. Or if you have to go to due process to argue for it, that's where we can go. And here's why that's so important. We know the article of faith, right? That students with more self-determination do better in schools. Well, we have significantly more research now. We know that self-determination goals lead to more self-determination. To a study on your screen on the bottom, having goals that are designed to build self-determination result in students doing better in school and out of school. In other words, self-determination, as I've said time and time again, is the key to a quality of life for people with disabilities. We get there starting through school. We get there by fostering it at home. We get there by encouraging it in IEP goals and objectives and through the student-led IEP. And when we do those things, good things happen. The studies show if we focus on it, it happens and improvement happens. That's why I recommend you ask those questions. What do you do about self-determination in your school? How do you foster? How do you build self-determination? And if they say, well, we understand it's important, but we really don't focus on that, now you've got studies that show. You've got a study that shows it is very important. Because if you do this, good things can happen for my child, and I want you to do this for my child. And it shows because we have these studies showing it's a best practice, showing that schools should, because the evidence supports it, focus on problem-solving skills, decision-making skills, and self-advocacy, because they lead to self-determination. Like I said before, it is unfortunate but true that schools are the #1 referral source for guardianship. And I always get asked why guardianship, why it's there. Last time we spoke, I talked about it being cultural. It's been around since the Roman Empire. But really, this quote up on your screen really hits it for me, is that just society thinks people need guardians when they think people can't take care of themselves. It's a nice definition. If I think you can't take care of yourself in an appropriate manner, you need someone to take care of you. So it's common sense, right? So if you can't take care, someone else will take care of you. Well, where do you learn in school to take care of yourself? Well, all the way through things like related services, but a really important time, transition planning. Transition planning happens at age 14 and beyond. It is, to me, the most important part of the IEP process, because school ends. You're going to exit school at 18 or 21. Transition planning is there to plan for the rest of your life, to get you to 91. So that's what transition planning is. And up on your screen is the definition of what is supposed to happen in transition planning. So first and foremost, it's supposed to be coordinated, working not just with the school, but with the student and others. And the point of it, look at the bold words, is again to help the student become more educated, more employed, and better at independent living. And the bottom really kicks it in. The bold words on the bottom, that transition services should be focusing on helping the student develop and achieve post-school adult living objectives and acquiring daily living skills. Which is why I will admit, I often get heated when I think about schools being the #1 referral source for guardianship. And when a parent comes to me and says, my child just turned 17, school's saying I better get guardianship next year. And to me, I look at this regulation and I think, what is a more important adult living objective than being independent, than making your own decisions? What is a more important daily living skill than directing your life, than being self-determined? Those things flow through everything we do. So when a school, even well-meaning, says at 17, at the point where they call it transfer of rights, and yes, IDEA does require schools to tell parents, when a child in special education turns 17, next year your child will be 18 and will be a legal adult. No one told my mom that, but for some reason, people with the law says for young adults with disabilities, parents have to be reminded they become adults at 18. The unfortunate thing is that often leads to schools saying, and therefore you should get guardianship because now your kid's an adult and you can't make any decisions anymore. Well, what I showed you from DC public schools is that's not true. We can work together. But what gets me is when a parent comes to me and says, the school said, I have to get guardianship next year. And I ask them, show me the last 3 years of IEPs going back to 14. Because, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with the school saying you might need a guardian if they have actually tried everything else. If you're in transition, and transition begins at age 14 in Delaware, federal law says it should start at 16 and go to 21. Delaware starts at 14. If at 14, the school looks at me and says, man, Jonathan has a lot of trouble making decisions. Jonathan may never be able to live independently. What they should be doing as a part of this transition planning is working on that post-school adult living objective of living independently, of acquiring the living skills of decision-making. What have they done? If they're telling me at 17, I have to get guardianship of my kid, I want to know what they were doing at 16, 15, and 14. At what point did they come to me and say, hey, guardianship may be an option, but here's what we're going to do to try to build your students' skills. In other words, if the first time I'm hearing I might need a guardian is right before I have to file for it, of course parents are going to seek guardianship. What's a parent to do? Someone you trust is saying you have no choice. That's when I do get heated at schools, because you have this existing obligation this existing obligation to build independent living skills, this existing obligation to build adult living objectives to acquire daily living skills. Don't just tell me at the last second we're not doing that. Show me what you've been doing for the last 4 years. Because if you tell me at age 14, this is what we're going to do for Jonathan. At age 15, this is what we're going to do. And if all that's been tried and it's still Jonathan's struggle, then I'm fine with the school saying, have you thought about guardianship? I am altogether not okay with the school doing that without even trying other things, because you have 7 years. You literally have 7 years of transition planning from 14 to 21. You have 7 years to create a plan, and studies support this, creating plans. Remember, transition is coordinated. So you have all this time to build coordinated plans. Who is going to help? How are they going to help? Who out there could help? Who can help us build and get the things that we need? Who can help us build education skills, employment skills, continuing adult education, adult services, independent living, and community participation skills? Who can help us put those together? That's what transition planning is about, is identifying those possible helpers. So many of them on your screen right now. Agencies like the State Vocational Rehabilitation, which we're going to talk about in a second, but service providers, specific organizations. If your child has Down syndrome, why aren't they referring you to the Down Syndrome Association? Why aren't we talking about Centers for Independent Living to help bridge the gap to adulthood? That's what transition planning should be for. And you've got those 7 years to put those things into place, to build those skills, to build self-determination, to incorporate supported decision-making so that your child can achieve. But that's not the only part of it that's important. Think about the article of faith again, and think about, special ed's hard. You have to qualify for special ed. You have to go through the process. You have to, every 3 years, you have to be recertified, et cetera, et cetera. You have to fit in a category. Wouldn't it be great if there was a program that did all the things that special education could do, all the self-determination, all the decision-making, but was available to all people with disabilities? There is. There is my favorite program for people with disabilities called Vocational Rehabilitation, or VR. I'm going to say VR a lot. You hear VR, think vocational rehabilitation. The whole point of VR is work. VR is there to help people with disabilities get what they need to prepare for, secure, retain, advance, and or regain employment, to get ready to work, to become work ready, to get a job, keep a job, advance in a job, or get a job back. So if there is something that someone needs to get a job, keep a job, get a job back, VR should be providing it. So when we talk about guardianship and supported decision-making, what if the same things that are keeping you from living independently, the decision-making skills, the lack of self-determination, what if those things that are keeping you from living independently are also keeping you from working? Well, like I said, VR is there to provide whatever people need, with very few exceptions, to get ready to work, get a job, keep a job, get a job back. So if that includes self-determination or supported decision-making skills, then yes, VR should be providing them. So first things first, in Delaware, VR is called DVR, the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. You can apply for VR services at their website. You can ask for a local office. If we're talking about school kids here, yes, the school can refer you, but no, I do not recommend waiting till they do. You can reach out to VR and say, I've got a child, I would like my child to apply. And here's the other thing, VR doesn't have an age limit. If your child is 58, if you're 58, you can go to VR and ask for services. We're talking about it in the context of students, but remember that there is no age limit for VR. If you are 14, if you are 94, as long as you qualify, VR can serve you, and they have to serve you. And what they have to do is provide you those things that will help you get ready for work, get a job, keep a job, or get a job back. And like I told you, it's hard sometimes to be eligible for supports and services. It's hard to be eligible for special ed or Medicaid waivers. VR is pretty easy. If you have 4 things, you are eligible for VR. 1, if you have a disability. 2, you want to work. 3, your disability makes it harder for you to work. They call that a barrier to employment. And 4, VR services will help you get around barriers so that you can work, you're eligible. If you're getting public benefits, SSI, SSDI, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, anything like that, you're presumed eligible. So those 4 things, they're all pretty easy. Having a disability and wanting to work. Having that disability make a barrier, and VR services help you get around the barrier. And here's the thing about VR. The agency has to presume that you want to work. They can't say you're just too disabled to work. They have to presume that you can work. If the agency thinks that you might be, quote unquote, too disabled to work, they have to give you a chance to work. It's called a trial work experience. You don't have to prove that you can work. They have to prove that you can't. They have to give you multiple opportunities to show that even if you're not ready to work now, that you can gain the skills you need to work. I've had a federal overseer tell me that 98% of people with disabilities should be eligible for VR, because the idea is to build the ability. Even if someone's not ready to work now, if they can be taught to be ready to work, they are eligible for VR. So that's huge, because once you are eligible, you get to make a plan to get the job you want. The plan under VR is called the Individualized Plan for Employment, IPE. I know it sounds like IEP, but they do work in the same way, so that's helpful. What the IPE is a roadmap. You are supposed to work with VR to come up with your goal, your employment goal, the job you want to get. You're supposed to work with VR to come up with what that job is. It has to be a job that you could have the skills to get, either now or when you've acquired those skills. Remember, you don't have to be ready now. You have to be able to get there with their help. And then that's your employment goal. If VR doesn't agree with you, they don't have to support it, or you can file an appeal and ask a judge to say that they should agree with you. For example, if I go to VR and say, my job goal is professional football player, they would say, you're 50 years old. You're not going to be a pro football player. We're not going to spend taxpayer money to help you do that. But if I go in and say, I want to be a computer programmer, and they say, well, you don't know coding language. And I say, but I could learn. I have the abilities. And they go, yeah, I guess you could learn. They must provide supports to get there. And remember, it's the job that you want to get that match your abilities. That's the point. You work with the counselor to develop the employment goal that fits your interests and your abilities. It's not just a job they put you in. I call them F jobs, food, fast food, janitorial, filth, filing, light office, flowers, light retail. Those are jobs that people with disabilities tend to get pushed in, and they're fine jobs if it's what you want. If you want to be a janitor or want to work in a restaurant, awesome. VR can support you to do that if that's what you want. But if you don't and you're being pushed into one of those jobs, push back. The law is very clear. It's your job, the job that fits your skills and interests. You should not be pushed into a job you don't want. Because once you have agreed on that job goal, your job with your counselor is to figure out what's blocking you from getting there. What do I need to get to that job goal? And what's in my way from getting there? Is it skills I need to build? Is it education I need to get? Is it technology I need to pick up? Because VR covers tons of things. When I do live presentations, I ask people to name something that stops people with disabilities from working. And a million hands go up and someone yells out transportation, or someone else says lack of a resume, or no job coaching, or no experience. Well, VR is supposed to provide all of those. On your screen are just a list of some of the things that VR has to provide if you need them to work. Things like counseling, job coaching, job search and efforts like writing a resume, assistive technology you might need, medical and mental health care. If medical and mental health needs are stopping you from working, VR can and must provide them. On-the-job training, job coaches, and yes, transportation, and even services to family members. If I can't work because I have a child and that child needs daycare, VR can provide that daycare if that's the thing blocking me from working. I've gotten all kinds of things covered under VR, not because I'm some kind of genius, but because the point of VR is to help people work. So one person I had got temporary rent paid by VR because it's really hard to get a job with no fixed address, or clothing, because it's really hard to do an interview if you don't have clean clothes. So things that you need to get there, to get over those barriers and get that job, are coverable by VR. And the great news, how does this fit supported decision-making? How does this fit the question of guardianship? Well, self-determination and supported decision-making are built in. The whole point of the IPE process, that individualized plan for employment, where you're picking your job goal, you're picking your supports and services, is an exercise in supported decision-making, because federal law requires DVR, vocational rehabilitation in Delaware, to provide you with informed choice. There's a definition of informed choice on your screen, but I can tell you it easier. Informed choice, if I'm your counselor, my job is to give you your options, to say, based upon what I've learned about you, this, and this appear to be important to you. Have you thought about doing that or thought about doing the other as a job? And if we agree upon our job goals, there's some supports you might help you with. Do you think you might need this? You think you might need that? To give you the information and advice that you need to help you crystallize your plan, to help you figure out what supports and services you need, who might be able to provide them. So again, my job as your counselor is to tell you your options, to help you understand what your choices are so that you can pick the job that's best for you and the supports you need to get there. Doesn't that sound just like supported decision-making? And if one of the things that is stopping you from getting there is taking care of yourself, remember, guardianship is the inability to take care of yourself. Well, what if that is also stopping you from working? What if you don't have employment or on-the-job skills like taking care of yourself or being organized or communicating with people or working with people? Well, I've had a bunch of, heated discussions with VR. Well, they have told me things like that aren't work skills, they're life skills. We don't have to fund skills to make you better at life, at taking care of yourself or being organized or working with other people. And I was telling them this, would you hire somebody who you knew was so disorganized they could not follow your policy? Of course not. Would you promote someone who doesn't get along with his or her coworkers or your clients? Of course not. Would you retain someone who takes such poor care of him or herself that they're always getting sick and getting the other people sick? No. Well, that means that these are employment skills, that these are a barrier to employment. So if they are, and they're also the kind of things that are pushing you toward needing a guardian, then VR can and should provide those supports. So if life skills are caused by your disability and making it less likely that you can live independently, then those same life skills are blocking you from working. And if they're blocking you from working, VR can and must provide services and supports to help you overcome them. So if you're a poor decision maker, if you're poor organized, if you don't have good skills, VR can provide that under ideas like therapy and counseling, ways to help you become better decision makers, more self-determined, so that you can do better on the job and in your life. So in summary, you work with VR using supported decision-making in several ways. To work with your counselor, informed choice, to identify the jobs you want and the supports you want. To identify the barriers to employment and the ways to get around the barriers, to figure out the supports and services you need and the providers who can provide them. All of that is part of the IPE process. And all of it is supported decision-making, just like the student-led IEP is supported decision-making. Informed choice in the IPE is supported decision-making. So that gives you the skills you need, both to get a job and to take care of yourself in a manner that society believes is appropriate. In other words, you overcome the barrier to employment and you overcome those limitations that might otherwise be pushing you into guardianship. And the reason I talked about special ed and voc rehab together is they go together. Vocational VR and special education are supposed to work together during the transition process. There's a federal law that gives voc rehab, DVR in Delaware, a lot of money, but conditions it on them putting significant emphasis on working with young adults. They are required and have been for decades to get involved in special education services, quote, as early as possible. And as I'm about to show you, if VR is invited to an IEP meeting, it has to come. VR is required to attend, and they're required to provide services to every single student with a disability in transition. And I mean that. You probably have never heard the phrase. Some VRs haven't heard the phrase. Pre-ETS. Pre-ETS are an incredibly important program. It stands for Pre-Employment Education and Transition Services, Pre-ETS. Pre-ETS are required to be provided to every single student with disabilities with a 504 plan with an IEP. So if you're getting disability-related services, either through special education or what's called a 504 plan, you should be getting pre-ETS. And the law spells out what those are. Just look at your screen and realize the possibilities for a student and the supports and services they can get. job exploration counseling to figure out kind of what jobs might fit your interests, work-based learning experiences like internships in school, after school, working and actually having experience working, counseling about what I might want, what kind of education might want, what might I want to come next, and two ones that I think are incredibly important. Workplace readiness training to develop social skills and independent living. That's in the law. That means that VR should know that those independent living and those social skills are part of work. If you can't get along with people, you can't work. If you can't be organized, you're not going to be able to work. Well, that should be addressed in high school. And instruction in self-advocacy, like ways that people can stand up for themselves, to work with others, including working with their peers, is an incredibly important skill. So if you haven't heard of pre-ETS, ask your school, what is your pre-ETS policy? Call DVR. I have a student, I would like you to come to the IEP meeting. That same law says VR must come to IEP meetings if invited. So this is your opportunity. Ashley, I'll be with you in 1 second. I'm about to finish up, actually. With these things, we can create opportunities. We can close the on-ramp to guardianship. Special ed and VR can work together to help the student learn, not just in school, but out of school, to develop skills to learn and work and live as independently as possible, and to find the supports and service they need to do it as well as possible. And that's all of that can be built through self-determination and supported decision-making. That's our goal, after all, is to maximize the self-determination of the people that we work with, to give them the opportunity to have the same opportunities, to give them the chance to do the same things as their non-disabled peers. And as I've said from the beginning, as you're going to hear me say again the next time we get together, the key to that is maximizing self-determination. That's what the studies show. And the way we can do that is enhancing decision-making through SDM. And thank you so much for listening. And Ashley, I'm happy to take any questions now.
Well, thank you so very much for that important and great presentation. I do have one question that was posed toward the end. Does the requirement to provide pre-ETS also apply for eligible students with disabilities who are incarcerated?
Yes. In fact, students who are incarcerated are to be served in special education through their local school district. So as long as someone is receiving disability-related services, an IEP or a 504 plan, the obligation for pre-ETS is there. I would strongly recommend don't expect it to come to you, ask for it. I think pre-ETS is a misunderstood service amongst state VR and amongst others. So be prepared. I gave you all, and you'll have my PowerPoint. At the bottom of all those PowerPoints, you'll see a thing called a CFR, 36 CFR, whatever. That's a regulation. I put it there so that if someone says to you, wait a second, we don't have to come out and talk to you about social skills. There's the regulation, circle it and say it's right there. Make sure that they know exactly what you're talking about and exactly what you want.
Thank you so much.
If there, I realize I stopped sharing my screen, so I am going to put my email in the chat box. I know I threw a ton of information at you today, and sometimes the best questions come up after you're done. Feel free to email me and any questions, and Ashley, please feel free to forward any. It's absolutely been my honor. I'm looking forward to talking to you next time, where we'll talk about building supported decision-making and incorporating it in healthcare and in other independent life areas like financial management. It's been my honor. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. And for everyone on the call, I did just want to remind you, I have dropped an evaluation link in the chat. Please take a few moments to complete that, as it helps to inform our future sessions. We really appreciate it. And the link to the Padlet with all of the relevant resources from today's session, as well as session 1, including PowerPoints, recordings, and resource guides, are included. So check that out. Let me just see if there are any other questions at this time. Yes, I did just want to echo those sentiments, and thank you again, Jonathan, for joining us. It is wonderful to hear from you and to learn from you. And thank you again to everyone who attended today. We hope that you will join us next week on Tuesday, May 9th from noon to 1 o'clock for the final part of this SDM speaking series. If you have not done so already, you can use the same registration Zoom link to access next week's session as well.
Thank you all so much, everyone. See you in a week. Bye-bye.